Hey class, welcome back. If you check out the board behind me, we're going to jump into the notes and what we did today in just a second. I want to start off today with a little bit of the textbook. If you look at our textbook like this, it's a good textbook, it's a good reference, and you can find it certainly as a PDF online, and it's out there in your Google Classroom and everything. But let me talk a little bit about textbook reading skills. I've assigned some textbook pages to read, and if you go through the textbook, it is not like this. This right here, Harry Potter book from my sister. And if you check out the Harry Potter book here, it's got a great story going about a young boy going off to a wizard school, meeting friends and battling against the forces of Snape and darkness and all that kind of stuff. The point being, if you look at a book like this, it's a great book to hang out with on a weekend and read, and it's got a plot, it's got characters, it's got character development, and you might sit down with your cup of hot chocolate and say, I gotta read my book now. However, if you try and do that with this, you will very, very, very quickly find yourself dozing off to sleep. It is a textbook, and when you look at a textbook, it doesn't read like a novel. It doesn't have amazing character development and amazing adventure stories. What it does have, and when you are assigned pages from a textbook, what it does have is pictures, for example, and when you flip towards the end of any given chapter, the key terms or the main vocabulary things, the reason I'm mentioning the end of the chapter first, a few tips on handling something like this when a teacher assigns a few pages from the textbook to read or a chapter to look through. First, go through the chapter and look at those pictures. In other words, don't try and read through the entire chapter like it's a novel. Just look at the pictures. In other words, say, okay, this particular chapter that I just opened up to randomly, it shows a little bit about the ocean. It shows a little bit about ecosystems. Oh, look, shows a food web here. In other words, get a feel for what the chapter is about. Look through the pictures. Illustrations are there for a reason. The textbooks, particularly in middle school and high school, have lots of pictures in them, so that's a good thing. And then, of course, you can read the captions under the pictures. Oh, this is talking a little bit about the energy pyramid. In other words, how energy goes from the bottom of the food web, works its way through the food web. In other words, after you flip through a chapter and you check out all the pictures, you get a pretty good feel about what it's about. Then, I would suggest, go to the back of the chapter and look at those vocabulary terms, key terms I call them when I assign them. Just an old habit of calling them key terms. But if you look at the key terms, you say, oh, wait a second, the key terms in here are habitat, these aren't ours for this week, but population, growth rate, community. In other words, when you go back and you read through the actual chapter, I'm already having to feel like, okay, I know what it's basically about. I saw the pictures from it. I saw the diagrams. And I saw these key terms right here, so I already know, oh, these are the things I'm going to be looking for. I know that these must be very, very important. I would even encourage you to do the extra step of reading the questions at the back of the chapter. Now, the teacher might not assign all of those questions. I certainly wouldn't assign all of these. But if you just read through the questions, you have in your mind like, oh, you know what? By the time I finish this chapter, I should probably be able to answer, hey, what are the three types of commensalism? I had to look at this chapter. I opened it up randomly to chapter 3. We're not quite there yet. So if you look at the book, in other words, don't try and read a textbook like it's Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. Instead, go for the textbook like a reference. Start at the end of the chapter, start with the key terms. And that brings us up to our notes today. If you look at the notes today, a really handy thing to do, and we'll do this a little bit more later on, is to outline the chapter. Remember, we use outline format, big Roman numeral 1, then A, then if it goes lower than that, 1, 2, 3, and that sort of thing. Let's fly through our notes today that we went through in class for first, second, and third period. Fourth and fifth period, we'll check these guys out tomorrow. We talked first about Protists, and I showed a little bit of Bill Nye to first period, but really we focused on the Tim and Moby. They covered the same kind of things, but here are two of the notes you might have pulled out. Protists are one-celled organisms that live in water, and they are probably the ancestors of the fungi, the fungus, the plants, and the animals. They are the step in between the bacteria, the archaea, and the eubacteria that don't have nuclei. They do have a nucleus. A protist does have a nucleus. And of course, so the fungus plants and animals. And this is when life started to get really, really complicated. One thing also, when you look at the life 4 billion years ago on planet, the first things to release oxygen into our atmosphere were cyanobacteria, a type of bacteria, and protists also, to this day, contribute about half of the oxygen that we breathe. Those of us who are into breathing, kind of a big deal. I pointed out in class, there's a couple silly things I've seen on science fiction shows. I saw, if you've ever seen the silly Doctor Who shows, Star Trek episode once, there was some other movie I saw recently where they go back in a time machine, and all these various science fiction movies, I see them go back in time, walk out of their time machine, walk around Earth, and they're supposed to be walking around Earth like 3 billion years ago going, wow, look at this, there's no big life yet. The thing is, in every one of those movies that I saw, you couldn't have done that because there wasn't enough oxygen built up in our atmosphere yet from these microorganisms for humans to be able to survive. There was really a mixture of carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, some other noxious gases. Couldn't have made it. I'm afraid that microorganisms to this day make big life possible. Even if they don't make the oxygen directly, they support the trees, and the trees then, of course, on land account for about half of the rest of the oxygen in our atmosphere. By the way, when you take a big breath of air, you've taken in about 78% nitrogen, an inert gas, inert as far as in the form it is in our atmosphere. In other words, it just fills up our lungs. However, the rest of it, the oxygen that's in our atmosphere, is contributed by the plants. And again, the plants, the ones that are contributing half of our oxygen, are only able to do their job because of microorganisms, the bacteria and the protists that we're talking about in this chapter. Moving on, we talked a little bit about the light that reaches us. One of the things that we're looking for all the time, I really hope we find it. I'd like to see it in my lifetime. You'll probably see it in yours. We're looking for life beyond Earth. One of the amazing things about biology is we know that the compounds of life are all over the place. We learned a little bit about the periodic table. We know that the elements for life are across the universe. The cool part is we know this because of light. There are galaxies where we can tell exactly what's there in terms of the elements and the compounds because of the light we receive. It's a cool little side trick of physics that we can figure out the elements and the compounds that are there based on the light that we receive. That's amazingly cool. We'll talk a little bit later about this discovery in the atmosphere of Venus, the high atmosphere of Venus. They found some compounds that we think possibly could have been put there by a type of bacteria like archaebacteria. Now, it's a pretty wild speculation, but the point is when we're looking for life beyond Earth, the thing that we're going to be looking for mainly is O2, oxygen, free oxygen in the atmosphere. You might remember I've sent a couple emails home about things to look for in the night sky. Hey, it's a science tie-in. We've talked about our moon observations. You can see Jupiter and Saturn in the night sky. They've been beautiful lately, really very, very close together. One of the things also asked you to look at was Mars. You can see Mars rising in the east somewhere around 8, 9 o'clock in the evening. And Mars, you can even tell when you're looking at it right now. It's only 39 million miles away right now. It's got kind of a rusty red color to it. It literally is rusty. The oxygen, if it is free in an atmosphere, generally combines with rocks. And most free oxygen doesn't last very long. So if you find a planet that's got oxygen in the atmosphere, there's a good chance it's being put there by photosynthesizing cells. So that's something we're looking for. That'd be awesome to find because we are in the process these days of finding extrasolar planets, which is very, very cool. Planets beyond our solar system. Okay, so protists, the most varied of kingdoms. They are mostly one-celled organisms, not all of them. You could easily spend the entire trimester talking about protists. It's such a complicated kingdom. I'm pointing out 4 of them here, 4 protozoans, which are part of the protist kingdom. We will study these much more in depth when we do our ocean ecosystem, but I wanted to point them out now because they're a good way to kind of jump into talking about the specifics of eukaryotic cells. So if you go up to the board here, the next page of notes was here. Protists can be very, very broadly broken into these 3 categories: plant-like, animal-like, and slime molds. If you look at plant-like, kind of obvious there, they can do things like photosynthesize. Animal-like, they eat. Now, when I said eat, you got to keep in mind when we have our pictures in the book of things like amoebas eating, it's a 3D thing. And if you look at the eating part, I had a piece of clay here engulfing a Lego. They move around with a pseudopod. And again, I pointed that out because in biology, it's a really nice way to figure out what it is you're talking about. Very often you can figure out a word by breaking it down into its parts. Pseudo means false, and pod, of course, is foot. If you think about like a tripod holds up a camera, if you look at a tripod that's 3 feet, a pseudopod, an amoeba walks around, if you will. With a pseudopod, a false foot, it engulfs its food and it keeps it in a vacuole. Again, I pointed that out today because we're talking about these particular protists because they're a great jumping off point to talk about eukaryotic life. But it keeps the food in a vacuole, a little place where it will digest it, and also these vacuoles might release waste products out to the environment. We talked a tiny bit about the FBI song, the fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates song that you learned at Outdoor Ed if you did Outdoor Ed. I was at Outdoor Ed about 1 year ago down at Jones Gulch. And of course, they teach you the Outdoor Ed song. If you're not sure about that one, Google it. The very first Google hit I got on YouTube was right from Jones Gulch down there, the FBI song, the fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates song. I think you might remember that from 5th or 6th grade if you went down to Outdoor Ed. And then finally, these 4 right here, if you need to pause it and write them down, go ahead. But I'll also put these notes out there online. But this is a jumping off place. These are 4 protozoans, protists, that protozoans are like a subclass of protists. And each of them have a very unique characteristic. So we're pointing these out because we're going to come back to things that get around like this all the time. Euglena, they are amazingly cool. They have photosynthetic, they have the ability to photosynthesize. They can get their energy from the sun, or they can eat. Very difficult for biologists to categorize at first. They can do both. They get around with a flagella, a whip-like tail where they zip through the water. If you check out Paramecium, amazingly cool as well. They move around with all these little cilia, these little hairs that are around the periphery of the cell that help them move through an aquatic environment. And finally, everyone's favorite, slime molds. Slime molds were formerly thought of as being fungus, but upon more investigation, they found out slime molds, which are incredibly important in decomposing things in, say, a forest environment. They're actually bacteria, but they are groups of bacteria that live together that perform the same function. So it's a quick recap of what we did today. I wanted to start off, and I'll do some more throughout the year, on textbook reading skills because, again, we're always assigned textbook pages, but you got to remember that textbooks don't work like a novel. You have to kind of sit with them for a little bit, take some notes as you go. Next time we'll talk about how to make good flashcards on the stuff that we read. Have a great day and a great week 9, and I'll see you online. Take care. Bye-bye.